Growing up without a father meant the world outside our door looked at us like something was missing. But inside that small rented house with peeling wallpaper and a crooked porch light, Mason, Ethan, and Noah built a world where nothing was lacking. They were more than brothers. They were a fortress. And Mason clung to that fortress with everything he had because deep down he knew he was carrying a secret that could blow the whole thing apart. Their mother, Denise, worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs, sewing late into the night just to keep shoes on their feet and hot food on the table. The neighbors called it a broken home, but to Mason it felt whole because every laugh, every inside joke, every backyard game of tag, patch the cracks life had dealt them. They called themselves the legendary trio, a name scribbled on the dusty back of an old photo tucked behind the living room clock. Ethan, the eldest, was the engine dragging them through school projects and backyard wrestling matches. Noah, the youngest, was the spark, always grinning, always dreaming big. And Mason, tucked in the middle, was the glue holding it all together, even if he sometimes felt like he didn't fit the mold he was given. Mason learned early that being different wasn't safe in their town. It wasn't something people said out loud. It lived in the way teachers looked away, in the tight smiles from parents at the PTA, in the murmured comments when he lingered too long by the art supply aisle instead of the footballs. So he learned to blend, to laugh when Ethan laughed, to cheer when Noah joked, to pretend every part of him matched what the world expected. Inside, though, he was growing heavier by the day, carrying the quiet realization that no amount of pretending could flatten the parts of him that didn't fit. The Thanksgiving season was always their favorite, even when money was tight. Denise found a way to make the house smell like cinnamon and roasted turkey. She stitched decorations by hand, cutting leaves from scrap fabric and stringing them across the living room with a threadbare yarn. Mason loved it all, the way the house seemed to stretch, to breathe a little bigger during the holidays. It was the one time a year when they could almost pretend they were just like every other family on the block. But that year, Mason couldn't pretend anymore. Every glance at the old mirror in their shared room felt sharper, harder to dismiss. The secrets he packed away so carefully were spilling out in the way he admired the way fabric draped, the way he hesitated in the boys' section of the store, the way he swallowed whole conversations just to avoid being noticed. There was a dress his mother's forgotten in the back of her closet, pale blue soft. When Mason brushed his fingers across the fabric, it wasn't about rebellion or spectacle. It was about breathing for the first time in what felt like years. He knew what was at stake. He knew wearing it to Thanksgiving dinner could shatter everything the 3 of them had built. But he also knew he couldn't sit at that table another year, carving turkey and passing rolls, pretending to be someone he wasn't, while the person he truly was dissolved behind his smile. As the holiday crept closer, Mason's heart hammered louder with each passing day. Ethan talked about college football games, and Noah dreamed aloud about moving to Los Angeles to make music. Mason nodded, smiled, laughed, on cue, but inside he was on a different planet, orbiting a moment he couldn't delay forever. Thanksgiving would be the night he either lost everything or maybe found something he thought he'd never deserve: freedom. Because real family isn't measured by matching appearances or performances for the neighbors. Real family shows itself when the mask drops and the ones you love choose to stay anyway. And Mason was about to find out just how strong their legendary trio really was. If you believe that true family is tested not in easy moments, but in brave ones, stay with hard stories. Mason's real Thanksgiving is just beginning. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived wrapped in a heavy gray sky, the kind that threatened snow, but never quite delivered. Mason woke early, the familiar creak of the hallway outside his door mixing with the sound of his mother humming softly in the kitchen. The scent of cinnamon rolls, warm and sweet, drifted through the house, tugging at the edges of memory. For a fleeting moment, he almost believed it could be just another Thanksgiving, another day spent passing mashed potatoes and pretending. But the dress folded carefully in the bottom drawer of his dresser said otherwise. Mason moved through the motions of the morning in a daze, peeling potatoes, setting the table, laughing politely at Noah's bad jokes. Ethan, ever the older brother, barked orders in the kitchen, like a quarterback calling plays, determined to make the meal perfect for their mother. No one noticed Mason's hands trembling as he polished the good silverware, or the way he hesitated before draping the tablecloth. No one asked why he seemed quieter than usual. Maybe they thought it was nerves, maybe they didn't want to know. He waited until everyone scattered to their rooms to get dressed before slipping into the one place that had always felt like sanctuary: his mother's closet. The dress was still there, hidden behind winter coats and old prom gowns. its pale blue fabric whispering promises he wasn't sure he could believe. Mason's hands shook as he slipped it over his head, smoothing it down over his jeans to anchor himself to remind himself that bravery could be quiet too. He stared at his reflection in the full-length mirror, wedged between boxes of forgotten Christmas decorations. His heart pounded so hard it was all he could hear. The boy staring back wasn't a stranger. Not really. He was just a version of Mason that had been waiting patient and unseen for far too long. For a moment, Mason simply stood there breathing. Then he wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, squared his shoulders, and walked out. The sounds of laughter and clinking dishes grew louder as he neared the dining room. Denise was carving the turkey. Noah was arranging the biscuits in a basket, and Ethan was pouring drinks, his back to the hallway. No one looked up immediately. Mason paused at the threshold, the worn wooden floors cool under his bare feet. A part of him screamed to turn around, to run back upstairs and hide, to pretend this moment had never happened. But he stayed. When Ethan finally glanced over his shoulder, the glass pitcher of sweet tea slipped from his hand, crashing into the counter. Conversation died mid-sentence. Denise dropped the carving knife. Noah froze a biscuit half raised to his mouth. The world tilted, and for a moment Mason thought he might faint from the weight of all those stares pinning him in place. The silence stretched so long it felt like a living thing wrapping itself around the room, squeezing the air from Mason's lungs. His hands clenched instinctively at his sides, fingers digging into the fabric of the dress. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to take it all back. But he stayed silent, willing himself to endure whatever came next. It was Noah who broke first. A choked noise escaped him, half laugh, half something else. Mason's gut twisted, shame burning up his spine. He had braced for anger, for disgust, but laughter. It carved a deeper wound than anything else could have. Ethan reacted immediately. He slammed a hand against the table so hard the plates rattled. Everyone jumped. Noah's laughter died on his lips, replaced by a stunned silence. Denise covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide and wet. Mason flinched, expecting the worst, expecting Ethan to call him names, to storm out, to tell him he had destroyed the only good thing they had left. Instead, Ethan's voice cracked the silence with something no one expected. "You think this is funny?" Ethan's voice was low, shaking, not with rage, but something closer to heartbreak. "You think it's easy for him to show up like this? To be real with us, when every sign out there tells him to hide?" Noah shrank back, his face flushing deep red. Denise blinked rapidly, her hands falling helplessly to her sides. Ethan didn't stop. His voice grew stronger, steadier with every word. "Mason's braver than any of us at this table. He's not the one who should be ashamed." Mason's knees nearly buckled. He had spent so long imagining the worst that he hadn't even dared to dream of this. That someone might actually stand up for him, not just tolerate him, but defend him with their whole chest, right there in the broken center of their family's life. Ethan crossed the room in 3 long strides and slung an arm around Mason's shoulders, squeezing tight. It was not delicate or soft. It was the same rough, loyal affection Ethan had shown 100 times before when they were boys, scraping their knees or losing soccer games or getting scolded for climbing trees too high. It was Ethan's way of saying, "Oh, you're still my brother. You're still one of us." The tears Mason had fought all morning slipped free, tracking silently down his cheeks. He didn't bother wiping them away. Noah sat rigid at the table, his face unreadable. Denise hovered between them, wringing her hands, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The moment stretched thin, trembling on the verge of something new. Not everyone would understand, maybe not everyone would stay, but Mason realized something vital standing there in Ethan's fierce, unshakable grip. He didn't have to fight alone anymore. And for the first time in his life, Mason understood that Thanksgiving wasn't about the food or the house or even the traditions. It was about who stayed in the room when it got uncomfortable, about who chose love when fear would have been easier. And even if the house was a little broken, and even if not every heart in it was ready, Mason had found something unbreakable in the ruins. The hours that followed Mason's stand in the dining room unfolded like walking across cracked ice. Every step, every glance, every breath felt uncertain, as if the whole house might fracture under the weight of everything unspoken. Dinner was served out of habit, not hunger. Plates were filled and pushed around in silence. Forks clinked against china, but no one dared speak first. Denise kept her head down, methodically carving her food into tiny pieces she never ate. Noah barely touched his plate, his fingers drumming silent rhythm against his thigh. Only Ethan seemed unchanged, eating with the same steady determination he brought to every family meal, as if willing the ritual to anchor them to something solid. Mason sat stiffly between them, his body aching with the strain of sitting still. The soft fabric of the dress pulled around his legs, a quiet rebellion in a room that pretended nothing had happened. His chest hurt from holding his breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It finally came when Denise cleared her throat, a brittle sound that sliced through the heavy air. "Mason," she said, voice tight, "maybe you should go change before dessert." There was no anger in her tone, just a desperate pleading. Undercurrent, Mason understood immediately. She wasn't thinking about him. She was thinking about appearances, the neighbors, the inevitable gossip, the fragile line between survival and scandal, in a town that still measured worth by conformity. Mason's stomach twisted, but he nodded mechanically, pushing back from the table. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, a jarring sound in the fragile quiet. He rose without a word, turning toward the stairs. Before he could take a step, Ethan's voice cracked like a whip across the room. "No!" Everyone froze. Mason turned, startled to see Ethan standing too, his chair tipped backward, forgotten. "No," Ethan repeated, voice louder now. Stronger. "He's not the one who needs to leave. He's not the problem." Denise blinked at him, confusion and fear warring across her face. "I didn't mean..." "You meant exactly what you said." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "You meant hide him? Make him small, pretend he's not who he is because it's easier for you." Noah shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Mason stood rooted to the spot, the blood pounding in his ears, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. "This family has survived worse than a damn dress," Ethan continued, his voice rising with every word. "We survived Dad walking out. We survived nights without power and days without enough food. We survived when no one believed in us but ourselves." He turned to Mason, then his eyes blazing. "You think you're breaking us, Mace? You're the strongest one here." The words hit harder than any slap could have. Mason's vision blurred. For so long, he had believed he was the weakness in their chain, the crack that would split them apart. Hearing Ethan say otherwise felt like someone throwing open a window in a room he didn't realize had been suffocating him. Denise wiped at her eyes but said nothing. She looked smaller somehow, folding into herself like a paper figure caught in the rain. Noah's mouth worked soundlessly. A million things he wanted to say, trapped behind fear and habit. Mason's heart broke for them, even as it burned with something fiercer: pride. Pride for Ethan, who stood tall and unflinching. Pride for himself for finally stepping into the light. But pride didn't erase the hurt. It didn't stitch shut the jagged wounds that yawned open between them now. The meal limped to a close after that. Denise cleared the plates without asking for help, her hands trembling. Noah disappeared upstairs the moment the dessert was mentioned. Ethan and Mason stayed behind, stacking dishes in the sink with mechanical efficiency, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable. When the last dish was washed and put away, Ethan clapped Mason on the shoulder with a gruffness that said more than any speech ever could. Mason leaned into the touch just for a moment, anchoring himself in the unspoken promise it offered. They didn't fix everything that night. Some things cracked so deep they couldn't be patched over in a single meal, a single argument, or even a single apology. But something shifted quietly but irrevocably. Later, lying awake in the narrow bed he shared with Noah, Mason stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft creaks of the old house settling around them. In another life, he might have stayed silent forever, swallowing down the truth until it rotted inside him. But not in this life, not anymore. Ethan had drawn the line in the sand, and Mason realized with the fierce, aching certainty that he wasn't standing alone on the other side. He had lost something that night, the easy comfort of pretending, the safety of invisibility, but he had gained something far greater. A brother who saw him, defended him, and chose him without conditions. In a world that often demanded silence from boys like him, Mason had found something louder than shame, louder than fear. He had found a shout that split the world open and made room for him inside it. The house, once filled with the clatter and chaos of three brothers and a tireless mother, settled into a stillness so complete it felt almost sacred. But silence could be a heavy thing. It pressed against the windows, seeped into the walls, curled beneath doors, and lingered like fog in every room. Mason moved through the days after Thanksgiving, like a ghost, careful not to tread too loudly, afraid to disturb the fragile truce holding them together. Denise returned to her routines with mechanical precision, scrubbing countertops that were already clean, folding and refolding laundry that barely needed tending. She spoke when necessary, but her words were brittle, like dry leaves crumbling at the slightest touch. Noah withdrew in the way only younger brothers could, retreating into headphones and sketchbooks, disappearing behind the blue glow of his laptop. He no longer cracked jokes at the breakfast table or pestered Mason about borrowing sweaters. He was there, but somehow not really. Only Ethan remained unchanged, moving with the same quiet steadiness he always had. If anything, he seemed more protective, hovering nearby when Mason ventured into town, walking with him when errands took them to places where stairs might linger too long. He didn't speak about the Thanksgiving night again, but his actions wrote volumes. Mason was slowly learning to read. Still, Mason felt the shift in their home like a splinter under the skin, small but impossible to ignore. He had forced the world to bend just a little to make room for him, but bending came at a cost. It frayed connections, revealed the weak spots everyone had been too afraid to name. There were nights Mason lay awake long after the others had gone to bed, listening to the old house sigh and settle. He traced the cracked plaster on the ceiling, with his eyes wondering if things would ever feel normal again, or if this brittle, careful version of their family was all that remained. One evening, about a week after Thanksgiving, Mason found himself in the living room alone, flipping absently through a stack of old photo albums Denise kept tucked under the coffee table. He hadn't meant to pull them out. His hands just moved on their own, searching for something he couldn't name. Page after page of smiling faces stared back at him. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, first days of school. In every photo, the trio was inseparable. Ethan standing tall and proud, Noah grinning with some new scrape on his elbow, Mason tucked between them, his smile just a little tighter than the others, his hands always just a little too carefully placed. There was love in those photos, Mason could see. It'd feel it even now, but there was also something else, something quieter, sadder, a shadow of all the moments he had hidden, pieces of himself just to stay in the frame. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to find Denise standing in the doorway, a dish towel still slung over one shoulder, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Denise crossed the room and sat on the edge of the worn armchair, her eyes flickering toward the open album. "You boys," she said finally, voice soft and tired. "You were my whole world, still are," Mason nodded, unsure what to say. His throat felt too tight for words anyway. Denise stared down at her hands, her wedding ring long gone, but the pale band of skin still visible. "I tried so hard to give you a home," she whispered. "Something solid, something better than what I had." "You did," Mason said quietly, and he meant it. No matter how messy or imperfect she had tried, he had never doubted that. Denise's hands tightened into fists. "I was scared, Mason. I still am. Not of you, never of you, but of the world, of what it can do to boys who don't fit its picture." Mason swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "I know," he said. And he did. In some corner of his heart, he had always known. They sat there, the photo album between them like a fragile bridge. Denise didn't apologize. Maybe she didn't know how, but for the first time, she didn't ask him to be smaller either. She simply sat with him in the quiet, letting the old wounds breathe. Later that night, Mason found a small package on his bed, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with a fraying piece of yarn. Inside was a pair of soft leather boots, sleek, sturdy, with a low heel polished to a shine. No note, no explanation. But Mason understood. The message was there, woven into every stitch. You don't have to choose between being yourself and standing tall. The days moved forward, slow and uneven, like a record skipping on a dusty player. Christmas decorations appeared around town, strings of lights winking from windows, wreaths tied to mailboxes. Life, relentless and stubborn, refused to pause for broken hearts. Noah slowly began to thaw. It started with small things, a silent nod when Mason passed him in the hallway, a plate of reheated pizza left outside his door. Then one afternoon, Mason came home to find a crude drawing taped to his bedroom door, 3 stick figures holding hands, the middle one wearing a lopsided blue dress. Beneath it, in Noah's messy handwriting, was a single word: "Still us." Mason pressed his forehead against the door and let the tears come freely, no longer ashamed of how deeply he felt everything. The house would never be what it once was. Some cracks never fully closed, but new things were growing in the spaces left behind. Fragile, stubborn, beautiful things that would one day be stronger than the silence that had threatened to swallow them whole. And Mason, for the first time, believed he could belong, not despite who he was, but because of it. A year later, Thanksgiving crept into town on a crisp November wind, painting the trees in deep gold and fiery red. The house, still weathered and creaking at the joints, wore its decorations like an old prize fighter, wearing his last championship belt, proud, battered, and fiercely alive. Inside, things were different. Subtle at first, Denise hung handmade garlands around the kitchen windows, humming softly to herself without glancing over her shoulder. Noah tuned his guitar at the breakfast table, filling the air with soft, aimless music. Ethan, now working part-time and saving for college, repaired the sagging porch steps without being asked. And Mason moved through it all like someone who had stopped holding his breath. That morning, Mason stood in front of his closet, fingers skimming the hangers. He could feel the nervous energy thrumming under his skin, the familiar flutter of doubt whispering at the edges. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation. From the back of the closet, he pulled out a carefully chosen outfit, a tailored blazer, dark jeans, and a soft flowing skirt in deep navy blue, masculine and feminine threads woven together. Not a costume, not a rebellion, simply him. He dressed slowly, savoring the ritual, then slipped on the leather boots his mother had given him last year. They still fit perfectly molded now to the shape of someone who had walked through fire and come out standing taller. When Mason descended the stairs, the house paused around him. Denise looked up from the table she was setting, her hand frozen mid-reach. Noah sat on the couch, a comic book forgotten in his lap, Ethan, hammer still in hand from fixing a loose cabinet, door straightened to his full height. No one spoke, no one had to. Denise's face crumpled for just a second, then smoothed into a smile so real and proud it made Mason's throat tighten. Noah gave a lopsided grin, flashing a thumbs up before going back to pretending he wasn't staring. Ethan just nodded once, slow and certain before turning back to his work. The table was simple this year. No fine china, no polished silverware. Just paper plates, a roasted turkey, a little too brown, and mashed potatoes, slightly lumpy. But Mason had never seen anything so beautiful. At his place, setting propped against a mason jar of sweet tea, was a small folded card. Mason picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. Inside, in 3 different handwritings, were 5 words: legendary trio, still standing strong. He bit his lip to keep from crying, but the tears came anyway, blurring the world into gold and fire in the warm, beating heart of home. Dinner was loud and messy, filled with bad jokes, second helpings, and the kind of laughter that shook the windows. Denise didn't flinch when Mason crossed his legs in his skirt. Noah teased him about stealing his fashion sense. Ethan argued over football scores and insisted Mason cut the pie, because the best dressed always gets first slice. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky turned dusky purple, they gathered in the living room with mugs of cider piled under old blankets, telling stories they had told 100 times before, but that somehow felt new now. Mason sat wedged between his brothers on the worn couch, feeling the weight of them against him, the way they anchored him to this moment, to this life. He realized he hadn't lost his family the night he wore the dress. He had given them the chance to choose him, and they had, maybe not perfectly, maybe not easily, but they had chosen him all the same. As the fire crackled in the small brick hearth, Mason leaned his head against Ethan's shoulder, feeling Noah's laughter rumble beside him. For the first time, he understood that bravery didn't just change the person who dared to step forward, it changed everyone who dared to stay. Have you ever had a moment when you feared losing everything, only to find that real love held on even tighter? Share your story with us in the comments. We're listening. If Mason's story touched your heart, subscribe to Heart Stories for more real brave journeys just like this one. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stay.